Good morning and God bless you on this Wednesday morning. Continuing our series, Can You Relate? We're going to be looking at Rebekah. This is Isaac's wife and the mother of the twin boys, Jacob and Esau. And we're going to be looking at Jacob and Esau on Thursday and Friday this week. But when you think of the story Rebekah, in many regards, it's kind of a romantic story. It begins with Abraham after his wife Sarah has died. He realizes he needs to go out and find a wife for his son Isaac. So he sends his most trusted servant with very specific instructions to go to the land where Abraham himself had traveled from and find a wife for his son there. And so the servant sets out on this task. I always feel sorry for the servant because here's a task like, how am I supposed to do this? There was so much faith, trusting that God would provide, that God would reveal the right person to bring back for Isaac. And sure enough, the servant has his prayers answered. God gives him the signs and reassurances that this young woman, Rebekah, is the one who's to be taken home and married to Isaac. So can you relate to Rebekah? You know, a young woman, not yet betrothed to any man, and perhaps wondering, perhaps longing, when would she find her partner? When would those things happen in her life? And then suddenly this stranger comes and tells her this elaborate story and how God had guided him there. To hear that, God guided me here because you are to be the wife of my master Isaac. Kind of crazy, but she talks to her family. All the arrangements were made, and then she goes to meet the man who will be her husband. And I'm going to just read a little bit of that story from Genesis chapter 24. I'm going to jump down to verse 62. Now Isaac had come from Beer Lahai Roi and was living in the Negev. He went out to the field one evening to meditate. And as he looked up, he saw camels approaching. Rebekah also looked up and saw Isaac. She got down from her camel and asked the servant, "Who is that man in the field coming to meet us?" "He is my master," the servant answered. So she took her veil and covered herself. Then the servant told Isaac all that he had done. Isaac brought her to the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebekah. So she became his wife, and he loved her. And Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So there's the meeting, and it almost sounds a little bit like love at first sight. Isaac looks up and he sees the camels returning. He goes to meet them. Perhaps he recognizes that this is his father's servant coming back. Perhaps he's got that expectation in his heart that he's bringing me back my wife. And Rebekah sees him coming and it's significant enough that she gets off her camel and asks, "Hey, wait a minute, who is this man?" And it says, after that he marries her and that Isaac loved her very much. Now, some of this story, again, is probably not something that we can relate to. I like to tell the story from a confirmation retreat that our youth director years ago and I led. We had exactly 6 boys and exactly 6 girls on that retreat. And when we got out to the beach house, I just kind of spontaneously said, I said, you might look around and you might notice that there's exactly 6 boys and there's exactly 6 girls. And your parents and our youth director and I have been talking that, dating is so complicated and so difficult that, we would just go ahead and use this confirmation retreat as a way of just pairing you up now. I'll never forget the look on the kids' faces because the ones who knew me well just scoffed. It's like, "Oh yeah, right, Pastor Tom." And there were a couple others that were in shock, like, "Oh my gosh, what is happening here?" And then there was one boy, I remember his face just lit up like, "Really?" That's about as close as I've come to arranged marriages. What was funny is the kids who were terrified, they didn't really believe me when I told them that I was just kidding then. But, arranged marriages are something somewhat of the past, at least in our culture, and certainly there's a downside to it. So we can't necessarily identify completely with Rebekah on that. And as a man, I don't think I can ever know what it's like to read this story and to have that sense of this young woman is being treated kind of like property. She's being negotiated for and given away. And that has to be something that as a man, I can't completely relate to what it would be like for a woman to hear this story. But here's the thing I think we can relate to about Rebekah. Later in her life, as Isaac has grown old and his eyesight has failed, and as she's watched her boys grow up, Esau to grow up to be this rugged outdoor huntsman, and Jacob to be one who liked to stay home and study and read, and she favored Jacob, and she clearly saw that Isaac favored Esau. She also carried in her heart that God had spoken to her and revealed to her that the older would serve the younger, that Jacob, even though he was born second, would actually be the one who would inherit the blessing passed on from Abraham to Isaac and now to Isaac's son. She knew that that's what God had told her. But as the years were going by and Isaac was starting to make comments about, maybe it's time for me to pass on the blessing to one of my sons, she began to feel that time was running out. And obviously God wasn't acting fast enough, so she had to take action. And it's kind of an amazing story for a marriage where it sounds like there was a lot of mutual love and respect. All of a sudden, she devises a plan that's somewhat diabolical in how elaborate the lengths she's going to deceive her husband, to trick him into giving the birthright to Jacob rather than Esau. So here's the question that I want to ask you, can you relate to? Have you ever had a time in your life where you felt like you knew that God had promised good things for you? And whether it's marriage and it's finding that companion for life, whether it's finding a home or finding where you fit, what your calling is, what your vocation is going to be. Have you ever had that sense of, what, God's not acting fast enough, so I guess I need to take matters into my own hands? Boy, I think all of us have had times like that. And sometimes we make decisions that actually make God's work a little bit more complicated, because whenever we lie or deceive or try to manipulate, we tend to create our own storm of unintended consequences that we can't control. And there's a real balance here, because I don't think God has told us, sit on the couch and do nothing until I tell you to move. I don't think that's the way God wants us to live our life. But there's a difference between going and working and having goals and pursuing them and being willing to let God direct us and redirect us when maybe sometimes those aren't inconsistent with His will, and sitting back and doing nothing. There's also a difference between being proactive in living our life and not giving in to lies and deception, things that are clearly wrong, in order to try and make the good come out of it. The ends do not justify the means sometimes. So I ask you, as you reflect on Rebekah's life, as you think of this ancient story of marriage and romance and love and children that are born, as you think of the complications of parents that favor one child over the other, but as you think of that central question of how many times you and I have tried to force God's hand or to help God do His job because our faith has grown weak, and we hear the clock ticking and we decide we need to take matters into our own hands. The beauty is that Rebekah is so central to the story of God's people. And through her and through her line, Jesus would eventually be born, a descendant of this woman. And so God's grace is able to bless and redeem even when we've made mistakes, even when we've tried to force God's hands. So God bless you this day, and tomorrow we'll take a look at the life of Jacob and we'll ask, can you relate?